Philosophical ethics in business. This is where we really start looking closely into the thinking that goes into establishing ethical beliefs and behaviors, and in our case, how they enter into business. We'll start by considering the traditions of utilitarianism, how we can determine the ethical significance of an action by the consequences that will result. Utilitarianism underlies a good deal of economic business thought and how this fits into free market economics and in maximizing the overall good. And there are strengths and weaknesses to the utilitarian approach. We'll also take a look at principle-based deontological ethical traditions. We need to pay attention to moral rights and how to know the difference between moral rights and legal rights. We'll cover the Rawlsian theory of justice and fairness and other virtue-based theories of ethical character. We start out with what we call the ethical question. How should we live our lives? Even in top-level business decisions, the thought process goes into the types of people we are and how we believe in other aspects of our personal lives. The theoretical takes us a step beyond just answering the question of how we should live, but also goes into the reasons behind why we should live the way we do and its justifications. Now, there's a notion that people around the world from a variety of cultures base their ethical views on particular religious or theological foundations. Now, that may in truth be the basis of ethical belief for many, if not most of us, but we also have to remember that the world has numerous religions and often with very different beliefs. So trying to establish proper ethics for an entire society, if not all of humankind, would naturally have us debating religion right from the get-go. That isn't going to work because people will never agree about religion. What we need is a base of solid ethical principles for all people. To do this, we delve into the area of philosophical ethics that apply to all people, regardless of religion, as well as culture, race, national origin, and the like. So we'll begin our consideration with utilitarianism, the making of decisions based on ethical consequences. A thought from the philosopher John Stuart Mill fits in here. The greatest happiness principle holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, and wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. Utilitarianism is based on a conviction that we decide what to do by considering the consequences of an action. The idea is to achieve the best overall results from a particular choice rather than the consequences. So what is better? Well, better tends to be what promotes human well-being through happiness, health, dignity, integrity, freedom, and respect for all people affected. The action that results in the greatest amount of any of these points is obviously the most ethically justified under the utilitarian approach. It's sometimes called the reasonable decision. Utilitarians tend to be very pragmatic thinkers. In their minds, there is no absolute right or wrong answer in all cases. Utilitarianism can meet and clash with business over a couple of key points: profit maximization versus public policy. Under the approach of noted economist Adam Smith, free and competitive markets are the best means for attaining utilitarian goals. Under this version of utilitarianism, there would be protections for property rights, deregulation of private industry, free exchanges, and the encouragement of competition. This, under Smith's ideas, would offer the maximum satisfaction of individual happiness. On the other hand, we have public policy. The public, of course, means all of us, and policy experts can predict the results of an action that will also attain utilitarian ends. And public policy and individual rights can clash. We see it all the time. Sometimes a person wants to do something with his or her own property that may be at odds with the neighbor, or with what government at some level decides goes against the public interest. Utilitarian ethics also has a couple of other problems. It's difficult to measure the consequences of alternate actions, and that can mean a tendency to ignore consequences to others, except those closest to us. Another potential problem is the ideal that ends justify the means. Will there be occasions where we ignore the stigma of carrying out bad actions no matter how much good we see coming from the decision? Well, the bottom line, the benefits of utilitarian ethics are no one's happiness is more important than any others. Utilitarianism describes much of the human decision-making process. It's easy to understand, and it forces us to examine the outcomes of our decisions. There are those, however, who argue that utilitarianism doesn't go far enough and maybe even has its own inherent disadvantages. Here we have the concept of deontology. Are there decisions that should be based on principle and not just consequences? This is the argument that the ends do not justify the means. Then again, how do we know which principles should always be followed and which ones should trump beneficial consequences? Deontological ethical theories endeavor to work out the details of these questions. We actually have a number of rules that we follow that are based on principle. For one, there's the law, even though following the law can often make us very unhappy. We also have the rules of our various organizations or codes of conduct. We even have that social contract called manners. That's right, manners. They just help things between us work better. Well, this takes us to the ideal promoted by the German philosopher Immanuel Kant. Respect the dignity of each individual human being. The Kantian categorical imperative has us following the rules upon which we should all agree to promote human dignity. There's also the concept that we should treat each person as an end themselves and never only as a means to our own ends. You've heard the term using people? Well, that's what we mean here. We now delve into distinguishing between moral rights and legal rights. Legal rights are those granted by some form of government through legislation or court rulings. Contracts also come into play here, and contracts are the mechanism that make business go. On the other hand, moral rights are those that lie outside pure legal decisions, although moral rights can play a role in setting legal rights. Moral rights, furthermore, cannot be contracted away. They lie outside the bargaining process. Now we'll take up the concept of social justice as fairness. Much of the concept of social justice comes from the thought of American philosopher John Rawls. Rawlsian justice takes basic ethical rules into the realm of societal contracts to ensure social cooperation. Rawls's theory of justice has a pair of ideals. There's a method to determine principles that should govern a society, and that those principles come from the method. Social justice deals with how the benefits and burdens of living in a particular society ought to be distributed. Controlling factors are that the principles have to be fair and impartial. They don't know people's abilities or disabilities, talents or weaknesses, and there's no idea about their position in societal structure. In essence, we're dealing with what Rawls calls a veil of ignorance. So in applying Rawlsian justice to business and economics, we're looking at two fundamental principles. One is that each individual has an equal right to the most extensive system of liberties. Equal rights are a fundamental element of societal justice. The second principle comes from the veil of ignorance in that benefits and burdens of a society be distributed equally as possible. Unequal distributions, however, are acceptable under Rawlsian thought when the least advantaged members of society benefit, and only if those benefits come from each person having equal opportunity. We also have a concept called virtue ethics. This is the making of decisions based on integrity and character. Here we're dealing with the type of person anyone should want to be or strive to become. Now this involves the character traits and virtues that make up a good and full human life. So we're not just talking about whether someone is good or bad, right or wrong. We're seeking a fuller description. In decision making, we can take this to mean, what would a virtuous person with integrity do? So now we've come the full circle with this unit. Determine the facts. Make sure they're relevant and complete, and keep your biases out of it. Identify the ethical issues involved. Identify the stakeholders. Determine anyone and everyone who will be affected by an organization's decisions, and pay attention to their priorities and what stake they have in the outcome. Consider the available alternatives. What are all of your choices? Use moral imagination. Consider how a decision affects stakeholders. What are the consequences? Seek guidance. Discuss the case with others. Get more opinions and perspectives. Assess the decision. Are you able to make modifications if you have to? Make sure you learn and move forward with increased knowledge as you face future similar decisions or make changes to the current situation.